Hi everybody, this is Tom from How to Quilt It, and we're finally here at the end of the unfinished UFO. So in this video you're going to see me put the binding on my quilt. I like to store my binding on a glass jar. I like to wrap it round to keep it nice and tidy and stop it getting all frayed. So here I am just unravelling it, although I actually now just leave it attached to the jar. And I just used a bit of tape to hold it in place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start away from a corner on one side. I'm going to leave myself an 8 to 10 inch tail of binding so that I can use that to join when I get to the next end. And what I'm going to do is attach it with a 1/4 inch seam. I've got a guide on my foot that's going to help me, and I'm using the direct feed of my Bernina machine. I take a couple of stitches and then back stitch to secure, and then I just sew all the way down until I get to a 1/4 inch away from the corner, using a nice and simple, easy straight stitch. Wish I could sew this fast in real life. Things would be so much quicker. I still haven't trimmed the threads on this quilt yet. I actually ended up doing that after this. So here I am coming up to the corner. I stop a 1/4 inch away, a couple of back stitches, and then cut my threads. And then what I'm doing is I'm folding that strip up parallel to the long edge of the quilt and then bringing it down to create a nice mitered corner. Now you can see the fabric kind of gets stuck here, and I'm not sure what happened. It's never done that before, but for some reason it wasn't feeding through, so I had to give it a little bit of a push. And of course, if in doubt, press the foot all the way down until it suddenly goes through. So now we're back down, 1/4 inch seam. And again, we're just going to sew until we get to the next corner. And we're going to stop a 1/4 inch away from that corner, take a couple of back stitches to secure it, and then cut our threads. Again, I've just folded that up and then folded it back down to create a nice mitered corner. Here you can see all those lovely threads that need to be hidden. So many of them, it's going to take forever. So we just repeat this for each side of the quilt. We just sew all the way down to the corner, stop a 1/4 inch away, back tack a couple of stitches, cut threads, fold the binding up and then down again, and then proceed to sew. And again, it got a little bit stuck there when it's coming in. So I think this is the final edge of the quilt. So there's one more corner left to do, and then we're back to the start. And what we're going to do when we get back to the start is we're going to finish and leave an 8 to 10 inch gap from where we started sewing the binding. And when I get to that point, what I'm going to do is just back stitch a couple of stitches and then cut my threads. Now this is kind of difficult to explain, partly because I can't remember how I did it, but also because I can't particularly see it very well on the camera. But I've cut one of the tails and created an overlap on the quilt, and then I've put those two pieces of binding right sides together and then sewed a 1/4 inch seam to join them together. And I've left myself, I think, about a 1/2 inch crossover between the two fabrics so that I can then trim it. Now what happened here was I forgot to use a leader before I started sewing, and so you can see that massive ball of thread where it got all tangled up in the sewing machine. So I am using a pair of scissors to try and trim it off, and then I will start again this time using a leader, as you can see. And I'm just sewing these two pieces together with a 1/4 inch seam, back stitch a couple of stitches to secure it, and you can see cut the leader off and then fold it in half and it sits nice and flat. And then I'm going to start where I finished, a couple of stitches and back stitch. Attach this all the way down until I get to where I started stitching, a couple of stitches to back stitch and cut, and then that's the binding attached. These are wonder clips. I absolutely love wonder clips. They're so useful for everything, including for holding papers together when you can't find a paper clip. So the next step in finishing this quilt off is that we're just going to fold the binding to the back. So I like to attach my binding by machine, and I like to do it on the front and then fold to the back and then stitch on the ditch in the front to then finish off attaching. I do actually iron this flat. I know a lot of people don't, they just finger press it, but I actually like to iron it and then iron it in half again. I just forgot to do it this day. I also think I was just desperate to be finished. And so what I'm doing is I'm trying to keep it as even as possible as I fold it across. And then just using a wonder clip to secure that in place. And what we do is we just go all the way around until we come to the corner. And when we get to the corner, I'm going to show you in the video how we did this mitered corner. So simple and so easy to do. Okay, so here we are at the corner. What we're going to do is we're going to fold it flat on one side, and that's going to create that little angle there. And we just want to gently pull it, finger press it, and then fold that over. Oops, fell out. Again, fold it over, and then it creates that nice little angle piece. Fold that then back down on top of the other side, and it gives us a lovely mitered corner. Now that corner actually needed to be adjusted a little bit with a pin because it's not a perfect 45-degree angle, but you can see in the front it's nice and neat. And because it's on the back, it doesn't necessarily matter too much, but if you were being a bit more of a perfectionist, I would have fixed that. So now here we are, 750% speed zoom through. And I'm just going around the entire edge of the quilt, just attaching that. There's that mitered corner again. That one's a little bit better. Trying to keep it even once it's folded over so that it looks nice and even all the way around. Not always succeeding in that because of the problems we had trimming the quilt, but trying to get it as even as I can. There's that mitered corner again. It looks good. And just use as many wonder clips as you need. You can never have too many wonder clips. I know some people like to just fold and sew as they go, but I like my wonder clips, especially because it helps me to get it nice and even, usually when I've pressed it. There's a little bit too much bulk in that corner, so I just trimmed it with a pair of scissors just to make it fit. All those threads, such a mess. Should have really trimmed and tidied up before we did this, but just desperate to be finished with this project. And there we are, back to the start. So it's now all beautifully pinned. And so now I decided that before I sewed this, because what I would like to do is just be done when I'm finished attaching that binding. So here you can see I'm attempting to bury some of the 9 million threads that are on this. And so what I do is I tie a knot, and then I bought self-threading needles, which seemed like a great idea at the time. And then I just pull that knot into the fabric, pull it away, and then pull it tight and trim it. And then that hides the thread. And I just keep repeating this process, pulling the threads up, tying a knot, pushing the knot to the bottom of the quilt. And then you can see here, this is why I don't like these self-threading needles, because that burst the fabric, burst the thread. So then I just had to trim it. Not ideal. So I'm just going to repeat this for every single thread. So this should take about 4 years. Again, that self-threading needle just really not happy. And one thing I found is that when you're threading it through the fabric like that, if you pull it just a little bit tighter than you want, it makes sure that it sucks the end back into between the layers, and then it definitely doesn't stick out. I thought I'd got the hang of these needles, but then it started to thread one and then the other wouldn't go through, and then by the time it got through, then it was all breaking everything. So eventually, after a couple of tries, I just gave up and got a normal needle and a needle threader, and for the time I spent faffing around trying to thread that needle, it was actually the same. And then we're just continuing to hide those threads. Lots and lots and lots of them. I wish I could hide them this fast in real life. So here you can see I've changed a normal needle and a needle threader because that self-threading thing's doing my head in. I'm going to get myself a Clover desktop needle threader because that seems to be much better. But this wasn't too bad, and I think in the end it actually took me about an hour to hide all these threads, because there was threads on the front and then there was threads on the back, because I actually didn't pull my bobbin thread up, I just left it on the back. But you can see once it's gone, it's actually quite neat and tidy. You can see the chalk lines from the previous design that I had planned to do, which I ended up abandoning because it was just too complicated. But it looks so much better with these threads attached, and I'm glad that I decided to do them before I finished the binding, because when you're desperate to finish a project, you really just want to, binding stitched on and that's it. All you need to do is wash and press it. when I'm doing these kind of tasks, I like to just put a YouTube video on, or I like to just sit and watch a TV show, just something that I can not really have to focus on tying knots and threads, just sit and enjoy. Okay, so we finished that. I've spared you the boredom of watching that for 50 minutes. So now we are stitching in the ditch on the binding to attach this. And what we'll need to make sure is that as we're stitching in that ditch, that we're catching the binding on the back. A couple of occasions where I haven't quite folded it enough, you find that the binding isn't caught by that stitch. Then you have to go back and either hand stitch it or then re-stitch it with the sewing machine. So I've changed foot as well. I'm no longer using a 1/4 inch foot. I'm just using a regular presser foot for this. That's a dual feed foot, so that it's pulling all of the layers through evenly as it stitches. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sew all the way down, and it doesn't really matter what part of the quilt you start in, but just as you come to a clip, just remove the clip, check the back, make sure it's folded over, and then work your way down to the corner. And when you get to the corners, they're dead easy. There's nothing to worry about. We just stitch all the way into the corner, stopping with the needle down, and then you're just going to pivot the quilt and then continue sewing. So you're going to see that in a second once I get to the edge of the quilt. So here comes the corner. And I slow down and I take my time so that I don't overshoot it. And then we want to make sure we finish with that needle right in the very corner of between the binding and the quilt, so that it looks nice and tidy, staying in that ditch. When I take the clip off the corner there, I just hold it with my fingers, but you can use a stiletto to keep it in place. And I'm just taking a stitch at a time, so I hit that corner and it's right in the corner, beautiful. Check the back, make sure that it's still folded in place, and then just work your way back down the next side of the quilt. And all you need to do is repeat that every single time you get to the corner. And I'm just checking there to make sure that the corner definitely caught. And now speed sewing. I use that little line that you can see in the middle of my presser foot just to keep the ditch lined up with that. And it just helps me to try and keep it even. So you can see a bit better there how the ditch is on that line. And it's fairly easy to stay in the ditch. Every now and then the quilt just shifts a little bit because of the weight, and so it ends up pulling it either the stitch into the quilt or just onto the binding. But just take your time, just manage the weight of the quilt as you go. Berninas have a little bit of a habit pulling to one side because of the way that they're feeding, I've noticed recently, and I've heard other people in videos talking about, but it's just learning what that means and how you compensate for it. Again, just stitch into the corner, slow down, and then take my time, and then we're done. Now there's a little bit that didn't quite catch, so here I am just going back and fixing it. You can see in the side of the frame there as well, I just keep the bowl that I keep the clips in right beside me so that I can just drop them in as I take them off and I don't have to look around, or otherwise they end up all over the floor under the sewing machine and then I lose half of them. And you can see every now and then I just have to check the fold in the back to make sure that it's going to get caught by that stitch. This quilt was a real nightmare to trim once we'd finished the binding, and in the previous part you'll see me complaining and whining a lot about what a mess I've made of this quilt. I don't know if it's because it's been lying in a cupboard, in a box, in a bag for so many years that it's actually just ended up becoming totally distorted, but it was really difficult to trim it and get an even way all the way around without losing tons of fabric in borders and corners. So this binding isn't going to be exactly perfect. It's going to be a little bit wobbly and squint because the quilt itself was squint, and there was just no way to get it even without cutting half the borders off. But there you can see I've come back to the start. I've just taken a couple of back stitches to secure, and I've cut my threads. And that is the quilt finished. So here we are, let's just have a little quick look at it out on the floor. So you can see it looks much tidier without all those threads now. There is still the chalk lines because this hasn't been washed, but there's my binding and my piano key borders. And you can see how it's looking a little bit wobbly in places and it's not quite straight, but that central motif is looking nice. I really like that, and actually it just adds a little bit of an accent to the middle of the quilt. There's a big thread there in the corner. Let's get rid of that. Oh. So yeah, very, very pleased. Now, we didn't manage to finish this in time for the end of June because there was a delay getting the binding fabric. So it was finished at the end of July, but finally we made it